So this is the second video in the variation and inheritance key area. So in the last lesson, we were talking about the two types of variation, which we call discrete and continuous. And in this lesson, what we're going to look at is what's going on in terms of our genes, our genetics, that produces this variation that we see within species. And we'll be focusing more specifically on the discrete variation that is controlled by one gene. But at the end, we'll come on to take a look at polygenic inheritance, which is all about the continuous variation traits. So we've got quite a few key words that you're going to need to sort of pick up on as we go through this lesson. And you'll make a note of these in your notes. And then we're going to do a little bit of practice in carrying out what we call a monohybrid or a genetic cross. Okay, so key thing to keep in mind from the producing new cells topic and from the reproduction topic is that we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. So all of our diploid cells have a total of 46 chromosomes. So why do we have 23 pairs of chromosomes? And the reason is that one copy of each pair came from mum and the other copy came from dad. So we can see that there. If we have a look at chromosome number 1, we've got 2 of them. One came from mum and one came from dad. Now the combination of all of the pairs is what makes you. That's why you are unique. You are not a complete copy of one or the other parent. You are a combination of that genetic information. Now, if we zoom in and look at just one of our chromosomes, we can see that on the chromosomes, there are areas, these bands that you can see, and we call these genes. And these are the basic unit of inheritance. And each gene is responsible for the characteristics of an organism. So we might have one gene, the one that we can see the arrow there, one gene that might control eye color. We might have another gene up here that might control our hair color. Another one might control our tongue rolling ability, whether we can or can't. Now, for discrete variation, characteristics that show discrete variation, like eye color, there is one gene controlling that characteristic. For things that show continuous variation, like our height, our skin color, these are controlled by more than one gene. We call them polygenic. Now, they are much more complicated to try and predict in terms of patterns of our inheritance than single gene traits like eye color. It's much easier for us to try and guess what a couple's offspring might show based on what we know about them. So genes located on the chromosomes and they control our characteristics. Now, genes may have more than one version. So if there is one gene for eye color, we know that there is more than one possibility because we can see that people have different eye colors. There's brown, blue, green, hazel. There are a limited range of possibilities, but there is certainly more than one possibility. Now, the reason for that is that genes can have different versions, and we call the form of a gene or the version of a gene an allele. So look at this individual here. So this could be the chromosome, the one on the left could be the chromosome that he got from his mum, and the one on the right is the chromosome that he got from his dad. Now, the one that he got from his mum suggests that the allele is for brown eyes, but the one from dad suggests that the allele is for blue eyes. Now, individuals should really only have one eye color in both of their eyes. So how is it that an individual who has got an allele for both versions of this, why is it they only show one? So that is something that we're going to have a wee look at. So key information then, different forms of a gene are called alleles. And for some genes, there may be lots of different alleles. However, you are only ever going to have two possible alleles because you've got one mum and one dad, okay, that are passing on this information. So our genetic makeup is the sum total of our genes. So we call this our genotype, but the characteristics which show up in our appearance are called a phenotype. So if we have a look, go back again, if we have a look at this person's genotype is brown and blue, but their phenotype is only going to be one of them. Okay, so we're going to have a wee look at why that is the case. So in this example, let's use brown. So the brown allele is represented by the letter big B, capital B. And the blue allele, we're going to represent that using the letter little b. Okay, so genotypes, when we are writing down a genotype for a particular characteristic, we use letters, okay? And we use capitals for one form of the gene and lowercase for the other form of the gene. We actually use the capital for the most dominant form of the gene, the one that's the most common and the one that will be expressed if the person has that allele. We use lowercase for what we call the recessive form of the gene, or the less common form of the gene. And this is the one that will not be expressed if the person has one of each. Now, this particular individual that we're looking at, we can see that we've got an allele for brown eyes and another allele for brown eyes. So mum and dad both passed on their allele for brown eyes. So this individual's genotype for their eye color is big B, big B. Their phenotype is brown eyes, because that's what they are showing. That's what they actually have. Okay, so we need to be very, very clear on that. Genotype is the letters, phenotype is what they physically show. So this person is big B, because they've got two alleles for brown, and their phenotype then is brown eyes. Okay, let's have a look at this individual now. So this individual has little b, little b. So their mum and dad passed on the allele for blue eyes. So the genotype, they are little b, little b. The phenotype is they have blue eyes. Where it gets more complicated is when we have somebody who has both alleles. So this person received the allele for brown eyes from their mum and blue eyes from their dad. So pause the video and I want you to think, what is their genotype and what is their phenotype? Okay, well, the person's genotype is, just as always, it is the two letters that they actually have. So their genotype here is a big B, little b. Okay, so the genotype for their eye color is big B, little b. But their phenotype is brown eyes. Okay, they have the allele for both, but they can't show both. We only show one possible form. So the one that gets expressed for their phenotype is the dominant one. The dominant one is always the one that we use the capital letter to express, and it's also, in terms of the population, it's the most common one out of the two. So they are brown-eyed, but they do have the allele for little b, for blue eyes. They're just not expressing it. Okay, so we need to be really, really clear on what we mean by genotype and phenotype for characteristics. And now we'll move on. So the phenotype for a particular characteristic depends on which allele is dominant and which allele is recessive. So in your notes, you need to explain what we mean by dominant and recessive. So we've got two good explanations here. Dominant alleles are always expressed in a cell's phenotype. Only one copy of the dominant allele needs to be inherited in order for it to be expressed. So in the example we've been using, the dominant allele, brown, is represented by the uppercase letter big B. So if the person has a big B in their genotype, then they will be brown-eyed because it's dominant. Recessive alleles are only expressed in a cell's phenotype if two copies of it are present. If only one copy is present, then it would be masked by the dominant allele. So recessive alleles, for example, the blue eyes, they would be represented by a lowercase letter, little b. So if we have a person who is big B, or big B, little b, then they will be brown-eyed. That will be their phenotype. The only way we can get the blue-eyed form, because it's recessive, is if we have two little b's. So it would be a little b, little b. We can use the two terms heterozygous and homozygous to describe a person's genotype. So if a person is homozygous, homo means same, okay? So where an individual has two of the same alleles in their genotype, they are homozygous. So big B, they're both the same. So that is a homozygous individual. Little b is also homozygous because the person has two of the same alleles in their genotype. We use heterozygous because hetero means different. So heterozygous would be big B, little b. Okay. Now, you should hopefully at this stage, if that's not been clear, go back. But at this stage, you need to have a good understanding of what we mean by dominant and recessive, what we mean by homozygous and heterozygous, and you need to understand how this relates to a person's phenotype, what they physically show. But what we're now going to look at is something called a monohybrid cross or a genetic cross. So if we know the genotypes of two parents, we can look at the expected possibilities of their offspring for that particular gene. So we're going to stick with our brown and blue eye example for now. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at two questions. One, is it possible for two parents with blue eyes to have a child with brown eyes? And we're going to have to explain the answer. And then secondly, is it possible for two parents with brown eyes to have a child with blue eyes? And again, we'll have to explain the answers. So we'll deal with these two questions separately. So let's have a think about number one. Keep in mind that brown is dominant, so it's big B. Blue is recessive, so it's little b. Okay, so let's start off with question number one. Is it possible for two parents with blue eyes to have a child with brown eyes? Okay, if the parents both have blue eyes, remember it's recessive, so the only way that they can actually have blue eyes is if they are little b, little b. So the man is little b, and the woman is little b, little b. Now remember, when reproduction happens, the man is not passing on a diploid cell. He's passing on a haploid cell. So sperm, remember, they will only have one copy of each of the pairs of chromosomes. So he's only going to pass on one allele, one copy of the gene with each sperm. So there are two sperm produced here. Both of them will be little b, little b. That's the only thing he can pass on. But he's only going to pass on one. Okay, one of each. The woman's the same. She's also little b, so the eggs that she can produce will either be little b or little b. It's the only possibility. And remember that when reproduction happens, it is when the nucleus of a sperm fuses with the nucleus of an egg. That is fertilization. So if this sperm on the left fuses with this egg on the right, we will have an individual who is little b, little b. If the sperm on the right fuses with the egg on the right, we will have an individual who is little b, little b. In other words, it doesn't matter which sperm meets which egg, every single time fertilization happens from this couple, they are guaranteed to produce another little b, little b. Okay, we can do this in a cross. So when we're doing any kind of cross, we use something called a Punnett square. And a Punnett square looks a little bit like this here. On the left-hand side of the Punnett square, I have put the dad, the possible sperm, little b and little b. At the top of the Punnett square, I have put the mum's eggs, again, little b and little b. And what I'm going to do now is, working my way up and down, I'm going to put the mum's eggs. So if we take the little b at the top that's on the left, we put that all the way down the Punnett square. And then we do the same for the little b that's on the right. We put that all the way up and down the Punnett square. So that's the mum's eggs being put in. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go across the way from left to right. We're going to add the man's sperm in, like that. Okay, so that is us saying if one of the dad's sperm meets either of the mum's eggs, we're going to get little b, little b. And then we're going to do the same thing along the bottom. Again, little b, little b. So if we go back to our question, all of the offspring from the two blue-eyed parents are little b, little b. That's their genotype. They are all homozygous, and they will all have blue eyes. So that is their phenotype. Okay? So the question asked, is it possible for two parents with blue eyes to have a child with brown eyes? The answer is absolutely not. Okay? Blue is recessive. There is no brown allele here from either of the parents, so there's absolutely no possible way for us to get two parents with blue eyes having a child with brown eyes. Let's have a look at question 2. Is it possible for two parents with brown eyes to have a child with blue eyes? Well, this one's a little bit more complicated, okay, because an individual with a dominant form, the dominant brown, could be big B, or they could be big B, little b. So that makes it a little bit more complicated. So there's a few crosses that we can do to answer this question. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to assume that both our brown-eyed parents are homozygous. They have two big B alleles, so big B, big B. So if we do the same thing as we did last time, in this particular case, both parents have brown eyes, they're homozygous. What are the possible genotypes of their offspring? So think about the last example. What do you think all the offspring are going to be? They are all going to be big B, because every time one of the sperm meets one of the eggs, it is going to be a big B meeting another big B. So can two brown-eyed parents have a blue-eyed child? Well, not in this example. This will not give us a brown-eyed child. All of the offspring are big B. They're all homozygous. They all have brown eyes. Oops, that's a mistake. Okay, what we're looking at now is we've got two parents. They both have brown eyes, but one of them is big B, little b, and the other one is big B. Again, both brown-eyed, because remember, if you have a dominant allele, that is what you will show. So the individual at the top here is still brown-eyed, but they do have a blue-eyed allele. Now, when we do that cross, now we have a situation where when the sperm and eggs are meeting, these are the four possibilities. They could produce big B. Again, that's brown-eyed, but they could produce big B, little b. These children are still brown-eyed, okay, but half of them are big B, half of them are big B, little b. So half are homozygous and half are heterozygous, but they all have brown eyes because they all have a dominant big B. They all have the brown allele. So again, we've got two different types of parents here now, but we have still not got a blue-eyed child. So is there a way that we can get a blue-eyed child? Yes, there is. Okay, apologies, the animation's a bit messed up here, but let's have a look at this. Now we have two heterozygous parents. Both of them are brown-eyed, but they both do have a little b in their genotype. So let's look at what happens now. One possibility is that we get big B. That's a brown-eyed child. One possibility, big B, little b. Another possible, big B, little b. But here we have a little b. So these two heterozygous parents could possibly produce a blue-eyed child. It's a small chance, it's 1 in 4, that's 25% chance that they would produce a blue-eyed child, but they could do it. So this is where we can introduce the idea of ratios. From this cross, from these two parents, we would get one big B, two big B, little b's, and one little b. Two homozygous, two heterozygous, but the phenotype ratio here is 3 brown-eyed, to 1 blue-eyed. Okay. So to answer our question number 2, is it possible for 2 parents with brown eyes to have a child with blue eyes? Yes, it is, but they would both need to be heterozygous. They'd both need to be big B, little b. Okay, that's an example of us using genetics, okay, to do a cross to work out the possible offspring that we would produce. Okay, I would like you to look at one more example here. So just to introduce how we identify different generations of individuals. So in this cross here, we have got a big B, brown, and we've got a little b, which is blue. These are the parents. So we identify the parents' generation as P. When we do the cross for this, every single one of them would be big B, little b. They would be heterozygous. That's the F1 generation. This is the first generation that came from the parents. If we were to cross 2 members of the F1 generation, 2 big B, little b's, we would then produce a second generation, which is F2, and we would get 3 brown to 1 blue, okay? Just like we did in the previous cross, big B, little b, we would get a big B, 2 big B, little b's, and 1 little b, 3 to 1 ratio. So the generations are identified by these terms. A parent generation is P. The first generation that comes from them is the F1. If we cross 2 members of the F1 together, we would get an F2. Okay, that's the second generation. Okay, have a little look at this cross, or this is what we call a pedigree chart, or sometimes known as a family tree. Have a look at this picture for a minute. So up at the very top, we have got, this is going to be our parent generation. So we would consider that to be P. This generation would be the F1 generation, and this generation would be the F2 generation. Okay. Now this pedigree chart is showing us information about a disease. It's called cystic fibrosis. And this is a disease that's caused by a recessive allele. So there are only 2 individuals in this family tree, this pedigree chart, who have cystic fibrosis. Because it's recessive, the only way a person can have the disease is if they are double recessive, so little c, little c. So you can see the 2 individuals in the F2 generation who have the disease. They are little c, little c. If a person's heterozygous, like all of the rest of them, where we can see their genotypes, then they are a carrier, okay, big C, little c. Now you might wonder why we've chosen particular letters. So why did I use B for brown? Well, that's because it begins with the letter B. We always use a single letter. Now the capital letter is the dominant version of the gene. The lowercase letter is the recessive version of the gene. That's always the rule. So this is something that you could perhaps have a think about. So these 2 carriers here, big C and little c, when 2 carriers reproduce, and you can see that down here in the F1 generation, when the 2 heterozygous carriers reproduce, they will produce a 3 to 1 ratio. We will have 3 individuals who will not have the disease and 1 individual who will have the disease. But sometimes we do not always get the outcome that we expect. So if we have a look at the 2 individuals who have produced the people with the disease, so they are big C, little c. So we would expect that if they were to have 4 children, that 1 would have the disease and 3 would not have the disease. But why is it that we don't always get the ratio that we expect? Well, the answer to that is because fertilization is random. Okay, we do, once a sperm and egg meet, we kind of have to reset the clock for the next time they have children. So if we are saying there is a 25% chance of a child having a disease from their 2 parents, that is the chance. Every time they go on to have a child, they have always got a 25% chance. But it's possible that they could have every child with the disease. They would be beating the odds, but it is possible for that to happen. Okay, this is a tough topic to try and grasp, so you may need to watch the video more than once. Ultimately, what you have to be able to do in your assessments is you have to be able to use your understanding of genetics to be able to do crosses and to predict possible outcomes. So there's a separate video which you'll be able to access, which is basically working through some past paper questions. Gives you a chance to try a question and then see how it's actually done. So well worth watching, and it will give you a little bit more insight into this process, carrying out crosses and answering questions. So please have a look at that video. The last little section of this video, though, is just to keep in mind that everything that we have talked about here is characteristics that are controlled by one gene. But the reality is that most characteristics are controlled by more than one genes, and we call them polygenic. These are the ones that show continuous variation, like height, weight, that kind of thing, skin color. So with these kind of characteristics, because they're controlled by more than one gene, the good news for you guys is we're never going to ask you to try and make a prediction. You'll never have to do a genetic cross for anything that has more than one gene. But just to give you a little bit of insight as to why we get this continuous variation, you can see that this particular example, we've got 3 genes controlling skin color, A, B, and C. Okay, and it's the combination of all of these. We can see there is more than just 4 possible outcomes. There is a huge range of possible outcomes. So in the example on the right here, you can see that we've got somebody who has all light skin genes, and we've got somebody who's got all dark skin genes, and they will produce a mix in the F1 generation. But then when we have 2 members of that generation reproducing, we get an even greater mix of possible outcomes. So we tend to find that in these sort of scenarios, most people will be somewhere in the middle, but there is obviously extremes at each end. It would all come down to what genes did your parents have that they then passed on to you. But this is just to try and show you that for continuous variation traits like height, weight, skin color, it's much more complicated than just 2 possible phenotypes. There is a whole range of possible phenotypes. Okay, so there was quite a lot in that. As I say, it's probably worth having another look at this video again. The most important thing at this point is that you make sure you have filled in your summary notes so that you have got clear definitions of the words phenotype, genotype, dominant, recessive, allele, homozygous, heterozygous, polygenic. You need to know what these words mean. You should also be able to carry out monohybrid crosses, which is where we are looking at the possible sperm and eggs from 2 parents based on their genotypes, and then what would be the possible offspring from fertilization. As I say, have a good look at the other video where I work through some past paper questions so that you can see how you would answer these questions. And that will hopefully make things a lot clearer and maybe make you worry a little bit less. All right, well done for sitting through that. It was a long video. Make sure the summary notes are complete and then watch the video on the worked examples from past papers.